A very brilliant affair. The Battle of Queenston Heights, October the 13th, 1812. Here, as promised so very long ago, is my video on the Battle of Queenston Heights. And what better way to discuss the battle than to review the very brilliant book, A Very Brilliant Affair, by the late Robert Malcomson. Robert Malcomson was a native of St. Catharines, Ontario, my Canadian hometown, and the author of several books on the War of 1812, including Lords of the Lake, the Naval War on Lake Ontario, 1812 to 1814. He was also an elementary school teacher and sadly has passed away since this book was published in 2003. The book opens with the 1853 unveiling of the second and current iteration, the current iteration of Brock's Monument, which is situated on the former battle site. And if you grew up in southern Ontario, like I did, you visited the monument, perhaps as part of a school trip, like I did, and you climbed to the top to look out over the former battlefield, like I did. And how many steps is it? Malcomson tells us in his appendix, Brock's Monument and Queenston Heights Today, that there are 235 steps. Well, I climbed them once when I was about 12. Today? Forget about it. A statue of General Brock sits atop the monument just above the viewing area, which gives the monument a height of 185 feet. At the time of its construction, it was the second tallest monument in the world, the tallest being Sir Christopher Wren's monument to the Great Fire of London, which topped it at 202 feet. It's appropriate that Malcomson opens with the monument, as his book will tell the story of why the monument came to be erected. The Battle of Queenston Heights, October the 13th, 1812. As you can see from the date, the Battle of Queenston Heights took place within the opening months of the war, and the opening chapters cover the events of the war on the Niagara frontier during the dramatic summer of 1812. As many readers will have never visited the Niagara, the book begins with a section on the geography and settlement of the area, a chapter which had me feeling really homesick. Darn you, Robert. For those of you who have never been to the region, the battle will be largely fought on the Niagara Escarpment, where it towers some 300 feet above the village of Queenston, then Upper Canada, now Ontario. The village of Queenston lies across the Niagara River from Lewiston, New York, while the Niagara River itself winds 35 miles, bearing the waters of Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, which lies some 326 feet below Lake Erie. Queenston and the Heights are just north of the world-famous Niagara Falls, where the river makes its most precipitous descent. The next two chapters explore the hurried preparations for war on both the national, i.e. Washington and Quebec, and the local level, for on both sides of the Niagara River, things are tense. British Commander Isaac Brock is frustrated by orders from his superior, Sir George Prevost, to refrain from offensive action, as he believes he could make a preemptive strike on the American Fort Niagara and possibly drive the U.S. out of the war. Brock has a limited number of British regulars to defend against a superior number of American troops, who can strike anywhere along the front. Although he suspects the attack will be against Fort George at the mouth of the river, where it feeds into Lake Ontario and which lies directly across from Fort Niagara. And Brock also has limited faith in the local militia, his native allies, indeed, in the entire local population. In New York State, it's even worse. American command has devolved upon a wealthy patroon named Stephen Van Rensselaer, a worthy gentleman, but no soldier. His chief military advisor is his cousin, Lieutenant Colonel Solomon Van Rensselaer, a former officer in the regular U.S. Army and a prickly character, more adept at making enemies than making invasion plans, and who is struggling with the after effects of a terrible domestic tragedy, the murder of one of his children, a boy of 6. As a member of the Federalist Party, Stephen Van Rensselaer had been against the declaration of war, but was maneuvered by his political opponent, Republican Daniel D. Tompkins, governor of New York, into accepting the commission. Van Rensselaer plans to run against Tompkins for governor in 1813. If he had turned down the commission, Tompkins could have labeled him as pro-British, while his acceptance implies tacit support for the war. Malcomson outlines the moral and logistical problems confronting Stephen Van Rensselaer's army, but the old patroon has yet another problem: a horse's ass named Alexander Smythe. Smythe was a brigadier general in the regular army who appears to have felt insulted by having to serve under Van Rensselaer's command. He and his troops will remain at Black Rock near Buffalo and across from Fort Erie. He even refuses to meet with Van Rensselaer, and this lack of cooperation will have disastrous results. Thus, even reinforcements are no help to Van Rensselaer, but Hull's surrender and the fall of Detroit puts pressure on him to do something. After an abortive attempt to cross the river on October 11th, Van Rensselaer's forces will try again on the 13th. The 13th, which will have unlucky results for both the Americans and for General Brock himself. The Americans set out just after 4 a.m., their embarkation point the old Portage Landing a mile south of Lewiston, and they land on a strip of shingles just south of Queenston. Spotted on their way over the river, the Americans have already taken casualties, the most serious being Solomon Van Rensselaer, who is hit multiple times and is shortly out of the fight. The American landing soon begins to collapse in both confusion and disorganization. But in spite of this, a detachment under Captain John E. Wool of the 13th U.S. Regiment scales a steep path up the side of the escarpment and captures the British battery on the heights above Queenston, giving the American forces the upper hand. General Brock, who had been sleeping at Fort George, arrives at Queenston around 7 a.m. after an exhausting ride of 7 miles over the muddy roads. While Brock knew an American attack was coming, he didn't know where. Brock believes the assault on Queenston may be a feint, and with characteristic energy, he goes and sees for himself. Discovering that the Americans now held the battery overlooking the town, Brock decides to dislodge them. Bad idea. Bad idea. With a force of around 50 men, Brock charges up the escarpment to retake the battery. Brock is 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", in an era when the average man is a bit over 5 feet in height, and he is also wearing a bright scarlet uniform. Brock is shot dead. British command devolves upon Major General Roger Sheaffe, who will lead a force of regulars and militia, including Iroquois warriors from the Grand River under John Norton, a force that will drive the Americans from the summit and lead them to surrender. Thus, Roger Sheaffe, not Isaac Brock, was the true victorious general in the Battle of Queenston Heights. But despite all the miscues, the Americans might have won if reinforced by their militia. Militia, who refused to cross into Canada after seeing the dead and wounded being returned to the New York side and after hearing the cries of Norton's Iroquois warriors. Nevertheless, it is a Pyrrhic victory, for Brock is dead. Appropriately enough, Robert concludes with an epilogue on the building of Brock's monument, doubly appropriate as the book opens with the monument's dedication ceremony. Now, this has been a very rough outline of both book and battle, but a very brilliant affair offers up a wealth of information. Among the maps are 6 which outline the phases of the battle from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. and illustrate exactly what happened, and would be especially useful if you live in the area or are visiting the battle site. Other appendices cover the personnel and order of battle for both sides, as well as the last words of General Brock. In addition, there is a valuable glossary which explains much of the military terminology used throughout the book. It's impossible to do this impressive book justice in such a short review as this, but it does a masterful job of explaining the personalities, the terrain, and the fighting on that October day in 1812, and how the survivors chose to remember the battle through the erection of Brock's monument. It is also a beautifully written book that was a pleasure to read, but sadly, Robert Malcomson is no longer with us. Let this book and his other works on the War of 1812 serve as his monument. My rating? 4.5, which is near classic status in terms of my rating system. But if you've read the book, what do you think, dear listeners? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this is your first visit to 1812 channel, my name is Warren, and I'm your host. I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the War of 1812. Instead, I'm a student wishing to learn about the conflict. Each month for the roughly 3 years of the war, I will outline the major events, and and I'll also try to review a book on the war, although I might be a little tardy, a little late. Did I miss anything today? Any errors? Then let me know in the comments below. When the barrage lifts, cheers! Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pix Here, that's PX Here, and show Fort George, and the ubiquitous Canada Goose, while the music was Intrepid by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod. Intrepid, which kind of has a spaghetti western kind of vibe. but I thought it was appropriate for a video which largely concerns itself with the topic of memory. Thanks for the memories, Warren.